Hi, I'm Christopher Ray, and welcome to the third of three video lectures about Qian Zhongshu's novel Fortress Besieged. Be sure to also check out the brief video lecture I made about the author's life and works. We've talked about war, we've talked about travel and movement, and in this video lecture I want to talk about language. This may seem like a book that is mostly about social satire, or is mostly interested in exposing human frailties and foibles, and to be sure there's a lot of that gives the novel its richness. But I also believe that this is fundamentally a novel about language. To begin with, while reading the novel, you've probably noticed there's a lot of literary allusions, cultural allusions, references to people, obscure and famous, and all of these metaphors and similes and other types of figurative language. And so why are they there, and what do they do? I'll introduce the concept of Menippean satire because I think it helps to answer some of these questions about what is going on with Qian Zhongshu's use of language. I find this to be a very funny novel, partly because of this narratorial voice. It's constantly commenting on the action. But I think we also have to give credit to the hapless Fang Hongjian for himself being very well read and very witty. But there's a difference here in that he keeps coming to grief, and the narrator, this kind of godlike, omniscient narrator, suffers no harm. So I feel like there's a bit of a double standard, and that raises a lot of questions for me about, well, are we mostly making a comment about human beings, or are we doing something else? So let's begin by talking about some of the allusion and wordplay that we find in this novel. Why are they there? What do they do? We're at a dinner party, and we are introduced to this kind of pseudo-philosopher character who's an object of contempt for the narrator, and he is described and analyzed as something of a thing through mathematical logic and references to Plato. So what's going on here? Here's another example from the same dinner party where Zhao Xinmei is offering a toast to the good wife of our great philosopher, another guest at the dinner party. And then the narrator offers several examples of Western philosophers who had shrewish wives. Here is one final example which represents some of the wordplay, not just the allusions, but just the play with language on terms like liu li for fluent that Qian Zhongshu often indulges in describing particular characters. So it's almost like he's using characters as a jumping off point for playing with figurative language. Menippean satire is a genre or a mode of writing that is not purely representational. It is one that is partly about the display of knowledge, and one that is very derisive. It uses knowledge to a particular effect, to make fun of other people, to put them down, to chastise them for their lack of knowledge. And it does this partly by piling up wordplay and allusions and references and paradoxes and jokes. It's also very, very deconstructionist. It likes to take people apart. It likes to take language apart. And I really like this formulation, mock away at system makers. There are several book-length studies of Menippean satire in case you're curious. Menippean satire takes its name from an ancient Greek who is associated with a philosophical school known as the Cynics. Cynics is related to the term dog. And cynicism, I would mention in passing, is something of an occupational hazard for philosophers and for scholars who know so much, who think so profoundly, and no one else can measure up. But there's virtually nothing to read about Menippus himself. He's not much of a historical figure because there's so little that we could actually know about him. So professional philosophers can tell you more about cynicism than I can. But in brief, I would highlight three things. That it puts a premium on clarity of reason. So it subjects a lot of things and peoples to this discriminating intellect. And there's this rigorous self-discipline imposed not on just other people, but also on oneself. So it's very, very self-reflexive. However, it's also indifferent to convention. It treats convention and typical ways of doing things with a lot of contempt. So it is very much an individualist philosophy that tries to liberate itself from those shackles of convention. And of course, marriage is a major social convention. So there's a cult of shamelessness, and people are not embarrassed to be different from other people. There's also an evangelical side of cynicism, that it's not enough just to self-cultivate. You also have to hound other people, right? This is where the dog references come in. You want to kind of convert them to the cause. The Canadian literary critic Northrop Frye has a very useful distinction between the novelist and the Menippean satirist. So he says that the novelist sees evil and folly as social diseases, but the Menippean satirist sees them as diseases of the intellect. So if only people were just smarter, they wouldn't be so evil and so foolish. So one implication of this is that a lot of the diagnostic work of Menippean satire is dealing with mental attitudes. So the Menippean satirist in this formulation pursues a couple of goals and uses a couple of techniques. One is to expose these inadequacies in people's intellect or moral vision through dissection and analysis. and another is to make this showy display of one's own superior learning and intellect. So you have a few forms of this genre. One is the mock encomium, in which we are being idiosyncratic and praising something that everybody else derides. So we are exalting the unworthy. There are famous examples such as Erasmus's praise of folly, the exaltation of ale, maggots, thumbs up for maggots. The key here is that we have a high form but very low subject matter. In the praise of nothing, look at all the things that nothing can do. Don't look down on nothing, we should celebrate it. Or to take another example from Qian Zhongshu's lifetime, Liang Shiqiu wrote an essay called The Fine Art of Reviling, in which he bullet points out all of the reasons why cursing other people is great. And you want to talk about an erudite literary figure? Liang Shiqiu, among his other many accomplishments, translated the complete works of William Shakespeare into Chinese. Qian Zhongshu himself did a lot of this in the 1930s and 1940s. So he has an essay called On Moral Instruction, where he says, the simple-minded might object that an immoral person who goes around chiding others is a hypocrite. To this we reply, what's wrong with hypocrisy? To teach others despite being ignorant is like doing business without capital, a veritable art. And he goes on to pursue this very paradoxical kind of logic about genuine morality can lead to evil. The road to hell is paved with good intentions. It's a way that some people phrase it. But he goes one step further in saying that, well, you may be a hypocrite, but if you tell people to be good, then you may yourself become good, and other people may become good. After all, you can fake it until you make it, essentially. So we should not call these immoral moralists hypocrites, or at least we should accept their hypocrisy. You can find a lot of other works in this vein in Qian Zhongshu's early writings. Another form of the genre would be the parodic learned treatise, in which you're bringing all of the knowledge you have to bear, all of the book learning, on something really humble, like eating. So one example from Fortress Besieged is the beginning of chapter 2, where the narrator gives us a mini disquisition on the definition of girlfriend. So a Menippean satirist like Qian Zhongshu clearly values learning and passes up no opportunity to show it off. But I feel like in Fortress Besieged, Fang Hongjian is not afforded the same opportunity. He keeps making witticisms. He keeps showing off his knowledge, often in a very flippant way, and he comes to grief. Here's one example from a conversation he's having with Zhao Xinmei. Zhao Xinmei has sent flowers to Miss Su's wedding. They have both been jilted, at least as far as Xinmei is concerned. However, Hongjian is not that concerned, and so he makes a linguistic joke about it and kind of riffs on the notion of flowers and their symbolism. However, Xinmei doesn't appreciate that type of joking, and he responds very negatively. In this example, Fang Hongjian is thinking to himself, and to me it seems a bit like a paradoxical encomia in which he is convincing himself that lying is a good thing. So to me, this is part of a larger pattern in which Qian Zhongshu is representing these characters as being entrapped and besieged, not just by social circumstance, not just by the war, not just by other personalities that they don't like, but also by language itself. And this is just one example of Fang Hongjian and Sun Rujia, who are having a conflict in their marriage, and all of this like verbal sparring that gets really, really nasty. And again, they use this term Qian Fang Bai Ji, where he is somewhat stereotypically and misogynistically referring to her as something of a shrew, who's very cunning and calculating and is trying to control and manipulate him. And she responds to that as well. But this is where I would distinguish my interpretation of the novel from critics who mostly focus on it as being commenting on social institutions or social types, or even the human condition. Because I think one of the institutions, a very fundamental one, that Qian Zhongshu is interested in is language. I think it's passages like this one that make people think that this is primarily a novel about humanism, about the human condition, and about these cast-off, unfortunate people who, partly because of circumstance and partly because of their own limitation and folly, end up on the streets or end up marginalized. Fang Hongjian comes across as something of a yegui, someone who is doomed to perpetually have this wraith-like existence where he's always on the road, never settled, never satisfied. But I think that the novel, too, as a whole, leaves us with this question of how much should we pity him? Because I believe that he's also something of a linguistic construct, not just a human being. If you just look at his surname, Fang, it's the same Fang as in Qian Fang Bai Ji, of all of these schemes and tricks. But it seems like all of his scheming and tricking and manipulations and movement only ends up outwitting himself. Let's take just one other fun example from the beginning of the novel. Fang Hongjian has a tryst with the seductive Miss Bao from the south, this dark beauty, who he meets on the boat. And Bao means abalone or salted fish. That's, of course, an aquatic creature, and she is indeed on water. It also calls to mind this idiom of the stink of the fish market. There's this great saying attributed to Confucius that if you spend too much time around evil people, it's kind of like spending too much time at the fish market. You stop noticing the stink, and you don't notice that you yourself are starting to stink. So what are the implications of a Menippean reading or interpretation of Fortress Besieged? Earlier in the war, Qian Zhongshu had written a number of essays, and Yang Zhang had collected them into Written in the Margins of Life, to which Qian Zhongshu wrote this preface in 1939. The book was published in 1941. I'm not going to read the whole thing now, but as you read through it, you'll notice he talks about life in very bookish terms. Life, it's been said, is one big book. And so anybody who is commenting on the book of life is essentially a book critic. And there are very superficial critics who want to cut straight to the chase and give us a conclusion. What does it all mean? However, there are other people who have a completely different approach and sensibility, who really want to just make insights and jot things down on the margins. So they're not necessarily changing the book, although they are adding to it. They are expanding the book of life by virtue of their scribbles. But this is a very humble position, and one that accepts all of the contradictions built into this enterprise. They aren't trying to come up with a final summation of what it all means. So I would argue that Fang Hongjian is multiple things. Yes, he is the target of social satire. He is the vehicle of social satire. He is a symbol of the consequences of human folly, of short-sightedness, of perpetual dissatisfaction. But he is also something of a scapegoat of the author, and that his wit and learning cannot save him, and that he only suffers for his witticisms. So to me, Fang Hongjian is also in part a device for the virtuoso display of learning in a very Menippean mode. He's not just a human being or representative of a social type. And there are several types of learning that you could point to. So in closing, I would say that we have the art of evasion at work here. We have the art and the arts, the Fang, so to speak, trying to escape from reality, trying to escape from the war, trying to escape from commitments. That is one level of understanding the work. But we also have an evasion on the part of the author here. Qian Zhongshu is acting very much as a Menippean satirist, in my view, and that he doesn't want to be pinned down. He loves knowledge, he loves displaying learning, but he's not going to give us a single yardstick by which to measure his characters. He realizes that language is fluid. He realizes that paradox is part of human existence and part of language itself. So even as he's making all of his judgments, he is not defining his grounds for judgment. So I would agree that Fortress Besieged is something of a self-consuming artifact, that it is constantly undermining its own assumptions. It is constantly deconstructing itself. But I would say that Fortress Besieged does something else as well. It is not purely deconstructionist or self-deconstructionist. Yes, it questions and undercuts many types of meaning, including some of the propositions that it makes itself, but it is also building an edifice of language. Despite all of the disappointments expressed in Fortress Besieged about social institutions, about the war, about human beings, I also feel like there is something affirmative, an affirmation of language with all of its complexities, all of its self-contradictions, and all of its richness.